that I have made. I have been talking about the order of the Hebrew Bible, and I've been trying to teach through that order, but I made reference to going through the book of Lamentations tonight, and that's not the order of the Hebrew Bible. That's the order of our Bibles in our Protestant Bible, which comes from the Latin Vulgate order. And so I actually even prepared to teach Lamentations and then just decided I can't do that. I've been talking about the importance of the Hebrew Bible order. And so I made a late pivot. And so, one, I was wrong. Uh, Lamentations is not after Jeremiah in the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to go to Isaiah. So please note that correction. Uh, you will see out of all the books in the Old Testament, it probably is fair to say that you must understand the first five books of the Old Testament to understand the Old Testament. And even to go further, you have to understand those first five books to understand the whole Bible. So it's hard to overemphasize the importance of the book of Moses or the Torah or the Pentateuch, whatever you want to call it. So if you're a new student to the class, welcome. There's going to be some vocabulary words that I've already used, and I'm going to tell you what those mean, and you could add this to your list of vocabulary. Maybe I'll provide it for you for an exam later on if you're taking it for credit. But one of the vocabulary words is Tanakh, which just is the way in which Hebrew speakers would refer to the Hebrew Bible. It's the same books as our Old Testament, they're just in a different order. So Tanakh. We could write it in English Tanakh. But in the Tanakh or the Old Testament, the first five books are called the Book of Moses, but they're called to Hebrew speakers the Torah, and that's where we get the T in Tanakh. So, L, if you're taking notes for class, those are two things that you may want to write down. That the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh, and the T in Tanakh stands for Torah, which is referring to the first five books of the Old Testament. Well, there in the Tanakh, in the first five books of the Old Testament, we met Yahweh. He was creator, and we saw that he made a place, a land, and it was crafted by Yahweh for Adam, who bore his image. And there you remember that in that perfect place, God dwelt among his people, and there was perfect peace in Eden. There was a perfect relationship between Adam and the woman that God made for him. They were given the mission to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and have dominion over it. But a serpent entered in and deceived the woman. And the woman disobeyed God, and then she gave that forbidden fruit to her husband, and he disobeyed God and ate from that fruit. And all of the race and all of the earth fell into rebellion and separation from God. And God cast them out. A key word for our students is exile. God exiled Adam and Eve from the garden because of their sin. And here we see that the consequences of sin is separation from God. God no longer dwelt among his unique creatures who bore his image. They no longer dwelled in the place that God made for them to enjoy fellowship with him by being present with God. And they moved eastward. And then we saw that not only does sin create separation between God and man, sin also creates separation between man and man. And so Cain murdered his brother Abel. And this also brought about a promise. So this is review, but it's going to be necessary as we get into what might be the most significant book in the Old Testament for understanding the message of the Old Testament, which enables us to understand the whole Bible. That's Isaiah. Is that serpent was cursed by God, and in the curse that God gave to the serpent, a promised seed or son was said to come from woman. and that son would crush the serpent's head. And so, Charlie, it may be that it's difficult to pay attention to Bible classes and Bible lessons. However, Charlie, have you seen a snake? You haven't? You'll see one soon. All right. Well, in one sense, the serpent is kind of like a snake, but not exactly what that snake is. And so the serpent, who is Satan, is promised to be defeated because there's going to come one from woman. That is a son born from a woman who will defeat, Charlie, the great enemy of God and his people, who is the devil, Satan. Well, we went through and we saw that God indeed was continuing to be gracious and to relate to people, not all people, but in that sense, selecting some and choosing them to be the ones of his favor or his grace. And we see covenants being made. And one of the key covenants that we see being made is that God chooses Abraham. And in the covenant with Abraham, he promises that there's going to be a great nation to come from his seed. And we keep following that line, and God indeed fulfills his promises. And despite evil being done, Abraham's seed becomes the great nation that is called Israel. And they are delivered by Yahweh from slavery to Egypt. And guess what happens when they are delivered? They're brought out from Egypt and brought into a new place. God actually has prepared for them a land that he promised to Abraham. And as they're moving these descendants of Abraham into the land of Canaan, God makes a covenant with them. That is what we can call the Mosaic covenant. You may want to call it the Sinaitic covenant. Some people like refer to it theologically as the Old Covenant. And there we see that in that covenant, God makes a relationship that is unique, because now, unlike the Abrahamic covenant, it requires something of Israel. They have to obey. And one of the things that we've been learning as we have moved from Exodus chapter 20 all the way through the first portion of the prophets, which led us halfway through the Hebrew Bible, is Israel has done nothing but break this covenant. But promises God has made, and promises God will keep. And in the book of Isaiah, we might come to what could be, after the book of Moses, the most important book in the Hebrew Bible for us to understand its message. And it's going to be taking these streams, that stream of what was promised of woman, the son to come from woman who would defeat the serpent. It'll take the promises that come from Abraham, and that stream of covenant promises comes into Isaiah. You take the promises that even come in the nation to this Davidic king. We'll see that this comes into the book of Isaiah. But we'll also find in the book of Isaiah, you not only have these streams of these promises God has made coming into Israel, especially as they are ushered to Judah, you also find in Isaiah they begin to go outward into the nations. That Isaiah also reveals how God is going to bring about fulfillment of these promises and bring salvation to his people, defeating all of his enemies, enthroning his Davidic king over all the nations. He even now gives some specific details about how do the other nations come into relationship with God fulfilling these promises. So if you're a student and you want to know one summary way to think about what does this very long book, 66 chapters, if you're taking notes, all right, there's 66 chapters. I'll give you a breakdown. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as I wish of these 66 chapters. But if you want to summarize what is, I think, a way to faithfully have a kernel that enables you to understand the book of Isaiah, here's a suggestion. God's glory, and I've taken this from a man named James Hamilton, God's glory in salvation through judgment. Now, each one of those is going to be very accented in the book of Isaiah, And they're going to, you could take them and think of them as like kernels, such that they expand and there's a lot more detail. So we are going to see that God is going to, in the book of Isaiah, he's going to emphasize his glory. And there's a particular section that is going to be very emphatic about the glory of God in the salvation that he is achieving through the judgment that he is bringing. And that would be in chapters 40 through 48, but we'll get there probably not tonight. But that would be the single most succinct summary of what you might give as a tagline for Isaiah. God's glory and salvation through judgment. Now, again, if we're trying to, this is what I'm aiming to do. Think in the broadest terms first, and then we'll move into more narrow terms. One of the things that we have come to understand, that when you think of all of the world, there is one particular people whom God has entered into a covenant with, and that's the Mosaic covenant. And that people is the nation of Israel. And we have seen that they have to relate to God according to the commandments that God has given to them. And God is to relate to them according to the promises that he has made to them. And so we have this, in one sense, this expectation. Yahweh must be faithful and Israel must be faithful. Now, Charlie, you and Elle are our new students tonight, so sometimes I'm going to identify you because I appreciate you coming to this class very much. But here's something that I know you can think about a little bit. You know that God requires you to do what he says is right. And you know that God is a judge, and therefore you would be rightly judged by God if he holds you accountable for when you do wrong. That's the right way to understand your life before God. Well, Israel was a nation that entered into a very clear formal arrangement where God specifically and uniquely revealed to them, this is what you must do. And when you do this, then this is what I will bring for you. Right? So in that sense, they understood, be faithful to Yahweh by keeping his law, and blessings will come to us according to the promises God has made. But one of the things we will see is that Israel fails to do that. So here then is the question. Charlie and Elle, is all lost for Israel because of their failure to keep God's commands? Say it another way, is the unfaithfulness of Israel to Yahweh, does that cancel out the promises of redemption? Does that mean that hope of salvation for Israel is lost? Even as hope of the nations being reconciled to God, is that lost because of Israel's failure? We can even ask the question personally, is hope for your salvation lost because of your unfaithfulness to God? The wonderful news of Isaiah is no, it is not lost. However, Isaiah will make very clear lots of details, some of which I do not know the answer to. The way in which Yahweh will show hope is not lost is a way that displays Yahweh's glory as one still being the just punisher for sin. That's what we call judgment. But through that judgment, bringing about the salvation that he has promised. And this is where we're able to see that salvation promised is going to hinge on, what do you think? I'm going to ask the older students. Here are your choices.
What was the question?
The salvation that Yahweh will bring through judgment, what does it hinge upon? Here are your choices. We'll give you two. Does it hinge upon the obedience of Israel? Or does it hinge upon the faithfulness of God to his covenant promise, who is going to, in one sense, be that Davidic king? B, correct. It's a tough class, so thanks for achieving excellence in your answer. this is what Isaiah is going to unfold, but it is going to unfold with so many specific aspects that I can assure you I will disappoint you about parsing out the details of how are these promises and prophecies particularly fulfilled. So one scholar said this about the importance of the book of Isaiah for us Christians today. He wrote, here the terrifying holiness of God is depicted as clearly as it is anywhere in the Old Testament, but also the unchanging grace of God is depicted as clearly as it is anywhere in the New Testament. Thus, in many ways, the book of Isaiah offers a summary of biblical theology. I've heard other preachers say that if you wanted to go to one book in the Old Testament and learn the gospel, you would choose the book of Isaiah. So I think we will learn that this is true. Now, for some of the advanced students, I need to go ahead and lay my cards on the table about some of the challenges that we're going to have with particular portions of Isaiah's book. Isaiah is a book that presents to us prophecies, very specific prophecies. And when you have prophecies, so this is not only for the advanced students, but Elle and Charlie, this is for you. Prophecy is when God says something is going to happen in the future, but he says it way before it happens. When God says something is going to happen in the future and we read that prophecy, but it has not yet happened, then this is what we face. How do we figure out if this prophecy has happened or if this prophecy is yet to happen? Or there's even another complicating feature to it. Well, has some of this prophecy happened, but not yet all of this prophecy has happened? And then this may be for our advanced students. Or yet, is there another way that this prophecy has in part happened through these particular fulfillments, but it has not yet completely happened through these not yet particular fulfillments? This makes certain parts of the book of Isaiah pretty difficult, and we will touch into it a little bit, but tonight we're just going to be going probably more broadly through Isaiah, and then next week we'll deal with some of the specifics. So there's going to be passages that will present us with problems of interpretation that I think we're not all going to agree on. It's not going to be a plain to whether we need to understand them literally or spiritually, maybe part of them one way, part of them another way, maybe both, maybe distinct. We, however, should recall that we're never promised as Christians in this present life a complete understanding of all the biblical prophecies before their fulfillment. The purpose that God does have for these prophecies is that we would be expecting God to keep them, and we would live obedient to God as we trust for him to fulfill his promises. That actually will be one of the main messages the book of Isaiah teaches us. That our response to God's prophecies, his message about what he's going to do in the future, our response to that is to wait and to trust in Yahweh to bring about the fulfillment of his promise. We should consider another part of dealing with prophecies and our response to them. I do think you have three choices. And these are, in one sense, these are kind of like decisions you have to make about, in your house, how are you going to do certain things? One of the things that when you read the Bible, you have to make a decision about is, okay, what are rules for reading the Bible? Now, Elle, as a student, I'm going to introduce you to a very fancy pants word. And it's only going to be helpful to talking to like your mom and dad on occasion, maybe Mr. Horner. All right. It's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics just means rules of interpretation. The Supreme Court has to use hermeneutics when they pick up the Constitution and other documents, and they have to make decisions about cases that come to them. Well, there's a decision that we must consider about Isaiah, and it has to do with what are the house rules for reading the Bible when it comes to prophecies. Does a passage that tells of something that is going to happen in the future, is the rule that that passage must have all of its fulfillment in a singular event? Is that a rule that you use for interpretation? Some Bible readers would say, yes, that is a rule that we have. And the reason that they would say that is it has some good reason. It's because, well, the author would have understood it in a way that meant a single event would have had to accomplish the fulfillment of what is being revealed. I don't think that is a ridiculous assertion. Another sort of house rule that we may decide that this is what we should do, is it possible that as we read about things that are said to happen in the future, is it possible that there may be an intention of multiple events bringing about the fulfillment of that prophecy? And so some people would say that the author in this case would have been like, if I go to the mountains, and you're standing really close to this mountain. Let's just say it's 2,000 feet, and you're standing at 500 feet, but you're really close to it, and you're looking up at this first mountain that's 2,000 feet, and you can't see the mountain that's on the other side of that 2,000-foot mountain that happens to be 3,000 feet because of your close proximity to the 2,000-foot mountain that sort of hides your vision from seeing the 3,000-foot mountain behind it. Some people would say that's the way that prophecy was given, such that the author could see something closer as a fulfillment, but God actually is revealing something that is even further away. Or it might be that some people say, no, you need to understand prophecies and their fulfillment only as it relates to what later Scripture says is the fulfillment of that particular prophecy, without any regard to the context of its original revelation, its original author and recipient. Well, these are some of the house rules that you are going to have to consider when it comes to reading and interpreting the book of Isaiah. As we get to some of them, I think one of the three house rules is better than the others, but I don't think that if you hold to the other two, that somehow you're like a Christian who doesn't believe in God's word, that your doctrine of inerrancy or inspiration is threatened. I just think that we will see in Isaiah some challenges that make us have to think it seems as if God has intended multiple events to bring about the fulfillment of prophecies. Related to this is the issue of typology. So for our new students, I think we're on our fifth major term. And that is in the Old Testament, when we're reading the Old Testament, studying the Old Testament, and in particular the book of Isaiah, we are going to deal with what is called typology. Typology means that God gives something that functions to either be a picture or a portrait of something that God is going to do that is very, very much like this first thing, but it will be greater. And so we are able to see that in the Old Testament, we've encountered some typologies. One of the ways that we've seen typology, especially in the Old Testament, is Eden was described as a garden where God was present and his presence was enjoyed by man. Well, later when Moses built the tabernacle, The tabernacle is seen by Moses in heaven, and it reflects, in one sense, what was described about in Eden. So people can rightly say it seems as if the tabernacle is a type of Eden. We'll see in Isaiah that we have to deal with this issue of typology and to understand at least, are these types pointing us to something that God has fulfilled in something greater, namely in Jesus Christ and what his salvation accomplishes. So for our new Old Testament students, those are some concepts, some technical terms that you'll need to understand what we mean when we talk about them. I'll give you an outline. It is really long, so I'll hand it out to you next week. But first, what we're able to see, the first 5 chapters of Isaiah is going to deal with Israel's sin and their future hope, but mainly their sin. Chapter 6 is its own special section, and we'll probably give a good amount of attention to the significance of Isaiah chapter 6, because in Isaiah 6, we see, in one sense, the kernel that is expanded in the rest of the book. The third section of Isaiah is chapters 7 through 12, and this is Yahweh's call to trust him, as opposed to, we'll say, earthly solutions. This is going to be, especially as we see the call to Ahaz to trust Yahweh and not Assyria. The fourth section is chapters 13 through 23, and this is where Yahweh pronounces oracles of judgment against the nations. Chapters 24 through 27, we see a vision of Yahweh's glory over evil. The next section, chapters 28 through 35, Yahweh shows his power to save and to judge. Then in chapters 36 through 39, we see Hezekiah's salvation. And then chapters 40 through 48, we see God's glory is his comfort for his people. Chapters 49 through 55 reveal the suffering servant of Yahweh. And then the concluding section of Isaiah is chapters 55 through 66. There's a little bit of an overlap there. Yahweh's future deliverance. One author said that a lifetime could be spent in each section of Isaiah, wandering through Isaiah to get an impression of the whole. One cannot help but seeing the majesty of the glory that Yahweh demonstrates as he judges in order to save, giving meaning to mercy. Well, first, let's give attention to the first 5 chapters. And this will tell us, why does God's judgment come upon Israel? Now, if you've been with us in the Old Testament class, you know the answer. Why does God's judgment come upon Israel? It's always for the same reason: Israel's sin against Yahweh. Israel's covenant breaking is the reason that Yahweh brings his judgment against his people. And so the book of Isaiah opens with a vision of Isaiah. We're introduced to him in verse 1. This is as close as we'll get to understanding who may have written the book of Isaiah, and I would suggest that it is Isaiah, but he is introduced to us as the son of Amos, and we see that it's concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So Isaiah will say things about Israel, the northern kingdom, at this point, but Isaiah is a prophet who is located in Jerusalem. He prophesies primarily to the southern kingdom of Judah. And here we see that he beheld this office of prophet the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. So he had a prophetic ministry that covered 4 kings of Judah, and he announces his opening message. Verse 2, he calls on the heavens and the earth as witnesses. And then Yahweh gives the message, sons I have reared and raised up, but they have transgressed against me. Now, this is significant because one of the things you've seen is the emphasis of a son in the Old Testament promises of redemption. And here we're able to see, how does Yahweh address Israel in the opening of Isaiah? As a son. So Israel, in one sense, Yahweh relates to them as their father. He reared them, he raised them up, but as his sons, they have transgressed against God. And so he gives a number of illustrations, but look at verse 4. Alas, a sinful nation, people heavy with iniquity, seed of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. They have forsaken Yahweh. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel. They have become estranged from him. Continues, and there'll be some description of the sins. The consequence in verses 7 through 9 of chapter 1 tells us that it is going to affect the land. It is going to affect the cities. It's going to affect the fields. They are going to be overthrown. And look at verse 7 of chapter 1. By strangers, right? The land, cities, and fields, strangers will devour them in your presence. It is desolate as overthrown by strangers. A metaphor chief in Isaiah that begins in chapter 1, verse 8. The daughters of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. Unless Yahweh of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. This is going to also sort of like a hint at what's going to happen. Israel is going to be, in this case, epicenter in Judah, but it extends to the northern kingdom too. The metaphor is they are Yahweh's vineyard. They are Yahweh's field. He planted them. He nurtured them. He cared for them. He provided for them. But what did they yield him? Bitter grapes is going to be one of the things that Isaiah will say. And that is to say that they've sinned against him. And so what's going to happen, and we'll see this in great detail, God is going to bring judgment against his people for their sins. To say it another way, the vine is going to have to be cut down because of its fruit being bitter, and God's going to start over. Now, we're able to see that this is because it's not that they didn't offer sacrifices. The temple, we'll see, was filled with sacrifices, but it's because they were idolaters. And an illustration comes in verse 10. Hear the word of Yahweh, you rulers of Sodom, give ear to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Now, just in case you're wondering if the Holy Spirit inspires maybe even sarcastic rhetoric, this would be an illustration to say, yes, the Spirit does. Is Israel actually, is Isaiah speaking to Sodom and Gomorrah? No, for Sodom and Gomorrah have been destroyed. It is that Yahweh is addressing Israel as if they are Sodom and Gomorrah. So the covenant nation of Israel is now considered in this prophecy to be the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And at this point, it is helpful for our cultural moment to see what kind of transgression would make God's Spirit call God's people Sodom.
Sexual immorality.
Well, we'll see. As we go on, listen. What are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says Yahweh? I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle, and in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats, I take no pleasure. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of convocation. I cannot endure wickedness. and the solemn assembly. My soul hates your new moon festivals and your appointed times. They've become a burden to me, for I'm weary of bearing them. So when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Indeed, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, purify yourselves, remove the evil of your deeds before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, execute justice for the orphan, plead for the widow. Come now and let us reason together, says Yahweh. Though your sins are scarlet, they will be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they will be like wool. If you are willing to obey, you will eat the best of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you will be eaten by the sword, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken. The faithful city has become a harlot, she who was full of justice. Righteousness once lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your drink diluted with water. The rulers are rebels, the companions thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and pursues rewards. They do not execute justice for the orphan, nor does the widow's plea come before them. And here we see it is two things. One, they have failed to obey Yahweh's commands in relationship to one another. And two, they have continued hypocritically to, in one sense, give fake or feigned worship to God through the sacrificial system. So Yahweh gives this language of judgment to them for these sins, that they have failed to love God and they have failed to love their neighbor. They have been unfaithful to the covenant that they made with him. But now does God promise mercy? He extends to them, we've already read, that it is possible that their sin could be removed, that they could be made what they're not, pure, but it does demand that they repent. It does demand that they humble themselves before God. And here we're going to see, look at verse 24, salvation is going to come, but it will come through judgment. Therefore, the Lord Yahweh of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, declares, I will be comforted concerning my adversaries, and I will avenge myself on my enemies. I will also turn my hand against you, and will smelt away your dross as with lye, and will remove all your alloy. Then I will have your judges return as at the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Afterwards, you will be called the city of righteousness, a faithful town. Zion will be redeemed with justice, and her repentant ones with righteousness. But transgressors and sinners will be broken together, and those who forsake Yahweh will come to an end. For you will be ashamed of the oaks which you have desired, and you will be humiliated because of the gardens which you have chosen. For you will be like an oak where leaf withers away, or a garden that has no water, and the strong man will become tinder, his work also a spark. Thus they shall both burn together, and there will be none to quench them. So here's, in one sense, the opening, the preface. Yahweh is going to judge, number one, his enemies, his adversaries. At this point, we don't realize that it's not only those within Israel who do not repent, but it's also going to be those whom will be his instruments of judgment to Israel, to Judah. So he will judge those who do evil, but he will also, verse 25, his hand is going to judge Israel, but it's for a purifying purpose. That God's judgment of Israel is going to bring a salvation to Israel. And so verse 26 tells us God is going to bring about the salvation that he has promised. It will be that in the end, especially we'll see centered in Jerusalem, it will be the city of righteousness. It will be the town that is faithful to Yahweh. And we're going to see the significance of that as we go forward. Well, chapter 2 begins with some specifics that come to the sin of Judah. Isaiah is parsing out the sins of Judah, and this leads to chapter 5, where Israel is considered to be the vineyard of the Lord. And Judah and Jerusalem, in particular, is the vineyard, the fertile hill, verse 1 of chapter 5, that God had loved. And he had cared for them, provided for them, verse 2 of chapter 5. And yet the last phrase in verse 2, but it produced only worthless grapes, or worthless ones. And so the consequences is judgment. Judgment. The vineyard is now open to those who are going to come and to remove it. Verse 5, let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall and it will be trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also command the clouds to rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of Yahweh of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Thus he hoped for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a city of distress. So this is what's going to happen in waves, both in the present as well as in the distant future of Isaiah's time. We'll call them Gentile nations are going to come into Israel, the land, and they're going to conquer, and they're going to capture the people of Judah and Israel and take them away. That's what the metaphor, this parable of a vineyard, that's what it's teaching. And Isaiah's message is going to have lots of information about how that's going to happen. And all of it is understood as Yahweh's action. This is Yahweh judging his people. This is, in that sense, the owner of the vineyard cutting down the vine because of its worthless fruit. This helps us to understand something that Isaiah uniquely emphasizes. Who rules over the judgment of God's people? Yahweh does. If you had a vineyard and you decided, I think I'm going to stop caring for it, and I'm not going to have a fence to keep all of the things that would trample it down, I'm going to remove that fence, and I'm going to let everyone come in and destroy it. Well, who would have the rule to do that to the vineyard? Whoever owns the vineyard. Israel, Judah, as God's people, God is the one who rules and reigns such that he brings in these Gentile nations who conquer them and capture them and lead them into exile. God sovereignly rules over his people, suffering his judgment. That helps us to understand one of the things of God's glory, always glory, that's going to be exalted throughout the prophecy of Isaiah. And one of the ways that it's going to be exalted is Yahweh is the sovereign king of the world, because he brings the nations to judge Israel. So one of the theological emphases of the book of Isaiah is the sovereignty of God. And God's sovereignty is clearly a sovereignty that rules over all nations. The nation Israel and its divided kingdoms, Israel and Judah, as well as all the other pagan nations. They are, in one sense, nothing but tools in the hands of God to accomplish his covenant promises of redemption. Now that's helpful categorically. How should American Christians then think about America? It is another nation in the hand of God for him to do that which he wishes. What are all the other nations in the world today? Exactly the same thing. And what will all the nations be as we go into the future, however long that will be? They will just be tools that God uses to accomplish his ends, because God is sovereign over all nations. Yahweh will clearly be glorified as the sovereign over all nations. And we see in chapter 5, his sovereignty is going to be exercised to bring the nations against Israel as the execution of his judgment. Look at verse 13. We already know what's going to happen. Therefore, my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore, Sheol has enlarged its throat and opens its mouth without limit. And Jerusalem's majesty, her multitude, her rumbling, and the exultant within her descend into it. So the common man will be bowed down, and the man of importance will be made low. The eyes of the lofty will be made low, but Yahweh of hosts will be lofty in judgment. And the Holy One and the Holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. Then the lambs will graze as in their pasture, and the sojourners will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. Now, that's going to be the pattern. Yahweh is going to bring judgment by his sovereign rule over these nations to come and to capture and conquer Israel. And then Yahweh will judge them. And through this judgment, Yahweh is going to bring about salvation and bring his people back to that promised, we'll see, final state of redemption where the world is totally different because of God bringing salvation through judgment. There's a series of woes that in chapter 5, and then we come to the significant chapter 6 in Isaiah. And the significant feature for Isaiah is that in verse 1L, there's a lot of people, L, today who are really thankful for President Trump. I'm thankful that God has given to us President Trump. But I'm not thankful for everything about President Trump. Uzziah is kind of like that. All right. Uzziah was not a perfect Davidic king, but he was not the worst Davidic king. And so there was a sense that Uzziah, a Davidic king, did a lot of good. And in this sense, Isaiah he's going to receive a vision and a call to ministry in this vision that in one sense is brought about because King Uzziah dies. And there is a temporal, we'll call it a temporal point of despair for Isaiah because King Uzziah dies. But we'll see with the death of this earthly king, who is indeed from the line of David, the vision that Isaiah receives is of Yahweh is king. And so we see in verse 1 a replacement in the vision of King Uzziah with the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up with the train of his robe filling the temple. Right, again, so in the vision, where is Yahweh, the king, enthroned? Is a not a trick question. Anybody?
What's that question?
Where is Yahweh enthroned? The temple. Now, when you hearken back, and I know it was just so impactful for you in this Old Testament class, did you hear when Exodus is walking us through the tabernacle, and then we come to the construction of the temple and its permanent location in Israel, in Jerusalem? Did you hear of any throne, any piece of furniture made and placed in the temple? Well, there was only the mercy seat and the Ark of the Covenant, but there was no throne. See, one of this does reveal for us an understanding what was the temple in Israel. It is Yahweh present, ruling as king in Israel. And so, in that sense, just like we saw in the beginning of Samuel, Israel wanted a man to be their king, and Yahweh interpreted that rightly as they're rejecting me as their king. And in one sense, people would ask, well, where's Yahweh's throne if he's king of Israel? And the answer is the temple. The dwelling place of God among his people is his throne. And here Isaiah is given a vision that the Lord is sitting on a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe is filling the temple. And then, Charlie, this is crazy. Verse 2, there are these special angels called seraphim. Charlie, these seraphim, they do what you just did. Look at verse 2. The seraphim stood above Yahweh in the temple, and they had 6 wings. So I have 2 hands. Imagine you have 2 wings here, and maybe 2 wings up here, and maybe 2 wings down here, Charlie. And then Isaiah tells us, what did they do with these 6 wings? With 2 wings, they did this. Now, these are angels. The word angel just means holy ones. All right? Angels have to cover their face because they cannot see the Holy One of Israel. Wow. So that's what they do with 2 of their wings. With 2 more wings, what do? They cover their feet, because even an angel's feet in the presence of Yahweh must be covered. And then with 2 other, they flew because they were not allowed to stand on the ground where Yahweh was. That's angels. So clearly, what is Yahweh? We don't hear anything yet in what is described, but what obviously is pictured by Isaiah's vision of the Lord. He's holy. And so now, that there's actually singing. That to enter into the presence of Yahweh is to enter into the praise of Yahweh. And one word is said 3 times. Right? And I've heard various comments about what is done here, but some have said that these seraphim would call out to one another in sort of like a cacophony of holy said 3 times. Others have said that the thrice holy God is said this way, for he is one God who exists in 3 persons. I'm not sure what is true, but Isaiah verse 3 tells us that they call out one to another, holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of hosts. Now, of hosts just means of the angels. But then they say, verse 3, the whole earth is full of his glory. Now, this is going to help us to see. If this is the vision that Isaiah sees of Yahweh in his throne room, which is the temple, which is in Jerusalem, which is in Israel, that's where he's seated, right? But where does his glory fill? The whole earth. What we're going to see Isaiah explain through his book is that the glory of God does come to rest first and uniquely in Jerusalem, in the world which will come to be, but it will move out from there over all the earth. All right, so just keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the book. And what happens as they sing, holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called out, while the house of God was filling with smoke. Now, for those who would imagine that somehow entering into the presence of the Lord would be a very casual moment, where you would be very comfortable, Isaiah offers a life-saving correction. In verse 6, verse 5, what is his response? Woe is me. Now, this follows if we did go through all of the woes that were given at the end of chapter 5, which really is the end of that first opening, chapters 1 through 5. Right? The woe is pronounced upon the sins and therefore the sinners of Israel. Now, Isaiah's immediate response to seeing Yahweh in his glory in the temple, who is sung and praised and related to by the holy ones, singing holy, 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 Isaiah says, woe is me, for I am ruined. And then he gives the reason, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts. Right? So here's something that we learn at the very outset in Isaiah's vision and his call. If you're going to be visited by Yahweh, you are going to be visited by the Holy One. And if you are a sinner, you will suffer his judgment. Isaiah concludes, I am a sinner and I live among sinners, and my eyes have now seen Yahweh, the Lord of hosts. I'm ruined. Now that is the right conclusion. However, what is provided from the very throne room of Yahweh for Isaiah? Verse 6. One of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs, and he touched my mouth with it and said, behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. So first, in order for Isaiah to survive the vision of Yahweh and to be, in that sense, through this, it's a theophany by way of vision, to see this vision of Yahweh, his sin had to be atoned for. His sin had to be covered. He had to be forgiven and made clean just to survive God's visitation. What do you think Israel needs? Israel needs Yahweh to visit her and also to be judged for her sin, but yet for in that judgment atonement to be provided. What we see in the call of Isaiah really gives to us in kernel form all that's going to follow for Israel, and we'll see even for the nations, that there will be judgment when God comes and visits, but God will also provide salvation. And it will be a salvation that he himself provides, and it will be a salvation that takes away the sin of his people through atonement. Now comes the commission, and we'll stop here. Yahweh, having now cleansed Isaiah from his sin, calls to Isaiah, whom shall I send? And this is when Isaiah says, here am I, send me. Now, this is where it gets a little strange, but it's critical to what follows. If you imagine that God sends you to do something, you might imagine like, this is going to be a good gig. I have just seen the Lord of hosts and I live. I have had my sins atoned for. I am now going to do his bidding. And what Yahweh commands and sends Isaiah to do is explained to us in verses 9 through 13. And we could sum it up in this way. Isaiah's job is to harden the hearts of Israel. Isaiah's job is to harden their hearts. Go and tell, this is verse 9, go and tell this people, keep on hearing but do not understand, keep on seeing but do not know. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and return and be healed. And Isaiah says, how long? Verse 11 answers, until cities are devastated and without inhabitant, houses are without people, and the land is devastated to desolation. And Yahweh has removed men far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. Yet there will be a tenth portion in it, and it will again be subject to burning, like a terebinth or like an oak whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is in its stump. So Isaiah's job is to go, and by the proclamation of God's message, he is going to harden Israel toward Yahweh, so that because of their hardening toward Yahweh, God will judge them for their hardening through these foreigners and make Israel, particularly Judah, to be like a stump. They're going to be cut off, taken out of the land, captured. But out of the stump, there's going to come a shoot, a seed. Here we're able to see through this language that Isaiah's job is to pronounce God's message, which they will harden themselves, and thus God will judge them. But through judgment, God will bring their salvation from the stump through this seed who will come through the remnant. There is a remnant in the people of Israel. All right, that's Isaiah's call. What then follows, we will see, will have lots of details, and some of them are going to be very clear for us to understand, and others of them are going to be more difficult for us to pin down. But the gospel and its grandness is going to be a part of what Isaiah is going to unfold for us. So next week, students, we will move from chapter 7. I'm going to try all the way through chapter 66. But you've kind of got the seed right now. If you get the seed, the first 6 verses, everything else is just sort of adding contour and details to it. Any questions, Scott?
A technical question.
Mm-hmm.
So 6:1 LSB translates Lord, Lord. But in 6:3 LSB translates Lord, Yahweh.
Yes.
So
different word.
yeah, so is that a pre-incarnate picture of Christ in verse 1? Is that Logos? Well, what's going on there?
Yeah, I don't think we're able to know by way of the text when we have a pre-incarnate, whether it's in a theophany or whether it's actual, an actual showing of the Son of God before the incarnation. I think we have to make inferences theologically. I find that theologically, it makes sense to understand God's physical presence before a person or a people to be a pre-incarnate showing of the Son of God. But I can't say the text is the reason that I believe that. I think it's theologically derived. So here, however, it's a vision, and it could very well be a pre-incarnate vision of the Son of God. But I can't say the text would dictate that, nor would I have any problems with someone who disagrees. The text is clearly saying that this is Yahweh. Janine.
Can you spell Tanakh again?
Yes. T-A-N-A-K-H. Some people may have it with just a K, but I think I think it's preferred KH is the last
Thank
two letters. Well, welcome to the Old Testament class. Elle, you did very well. Charlie, you did very well too. And we'll come back next week and try to finish Isaiah. You're dismissed.